Did you do did you make an arrangement with Katie or it didn't work out?
No, wasn't able to
Well,
technically.
we are live. Norm and Mouin, we are live just so everyone knows because this is not what Connections usually does, but times have changed. We are live on Jadaliyya's Facebook. We are live on Jadaliyya's YouTube channel, and we are live on Jadaliyya's Twitter account or X account. I'm going to disappear. Have a good conversation, folks.
Thank you, Bassam. Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute's interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this second of 4 special episodes about the International Court of Justice hearings on genocide in the Gaza Strip, we're joined once again by Norman Finkelstein. Imagine if the Nuremberg trials were held in 1942. That's how it felt watching the Republic of South Africa present its historic and, in my view, comprehensive, devastating, and utterly compelling case against Israel at the International Court of Justice today. I'm delighted to be joined once again by the world-renowned forensic scholar and best-selling author Norman Finkelstein. He counts among his numerous publications the highly acclaimed Gaza, an Inquest into Its Martyrdom. As mentioned, today we will be discussing South Africa's oral arguments and preview Israel's, which are scheduled for tomorrow. Norman Finkelstein, it's a real pleasure to welcome you once again to Connections.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be on with you.
Thank you, Norman. I think I'd like to start by asking what your reaction was. You've watched, I think you stayed up well after midnight to watch the South African oral arguments live. What was your reaction as a human being, let's say, first of all, before we get into the legal and political dimensions of South Africa's case?
On the personal level, it was very painful. I am not a Judeo-centric personality. I call myself, and I believe myself to be, an internationalist, but we all have that, so to speak, ethnic residue. And it was really a deep shame, I felt, that Israel was, the Jewish state, as it's called, was in the dock at the World Court, the International Court of Justice, in order to defend themselves against the charge of genocide. When I grew up, we were all, as Jewish leftists, we were always cognizant of a great Jewish leftist tradition. You know, Sartre, the philosopher, he once said, it's not inaccurate to say that the Russian Revolution was made by Jews. Lenin, it later turned out, was 1/4 Jewish, but his Jewish side was not prominent. But everybody else in the Bolshevik Party, Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, Bukharin, you go down the line, they were all Jews. And in the American Communist Party, Jews were way overrepresented in the ranks of the party. And then you take another episode for which I was very proud, which is 1,000 of the 3,000 folks who volunteered to fight in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. They were Jewish.
This is the Abraham Lincoln Brigade.
The Abraham Lincoln Brigade. They were Jewish, and those are all part of my, so to speak, political DNA. And there was a real feeling of, dare I say it, ethnic pride in that fact. And to see this site, and it wasn't just to see this site, it's the fact that Jews around the world feel this need to rally behind a state engaged in this genocide. And the other, the thought to myself was how times, change. Germany was the hallmark of culture and the political left. The German Social Democratic Party was the party in the international. And
this is between the late 19th century and the 1930s, let's say.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And then what happens? The great German civilization, the place where everyone went to study, the German universities, and the center of culture, Nazism. you know, the most barbaric form of barbaric political system in the modern world. And now the same thing with Israel. It went from being the archetypical victim of genocide to now being there. So that was a very sobering and, I have to say, disconcerting sight. But the other side of it was the South African delegation. It was deeply moving. This is the post-apartheid South Africa. And you saw it in the ranks of their delegation. There were, even though it's a Black majority state now, there were 4 whites who were selected for that delegation. Vaughan Lowe, John Dugard, a fellow, I can't remember his name.
Duplessis, I think.
Yes, it was excellent. And the woman, actually 2 white women, so it's 5 members of the delegation.
One of whom I think is Irish rather than South African.
Oh, who was the one who was speaking in French?
That was her. Please don't ask me to recall her name.
Well, they selected then 5 white people in a post-apartheid South Africa country, which is predominantly Black. There were several Black people represented. There were older people, Vaughan Lowe and John Dugard, younger people. It was just an utterly beautiful
The Rainbow Nation.
Yes. And there was something else that was so deeply moving about it. Because as you know, they say states have no friends, they just have interests. Okay, that's a cliche. Here was South Africa defending the people of Gaza with no quid for the pro. You know, the expression quid pro quo, this for that. There was no this for that. It's 2.3 million people. Their political leadership is reviled and despised all over the world. Hamas. They have nothing to offer anyone. There is no quid for the pro quo. And yet South Africa took up their cause. It didn't just take up their cause.
They led it.
Excuse me?
They led it.
They not only led it, but you know, Mouin, it's very easy to just file a brief and then go goodbye. They created the dispute because you needed the dispute in order to bring it before the court. And you could see it was very premeditated what South Africa was doing. It was slowly building its case to demonstrate we have a dispute here. It then produced a very professional brief. It then sent a very high-level delegation. Naming one other country in the world that would have done that for an utterly destitute, wretched people. An utterly destitute, wretched people. The state of Palestine didn't do that for the people of Gaza. They were asked about that today, you know. Why didn't you file the brief?
Israel wouldn't let them? Was that the answer?
They said we would be accused of politicizing the court. So it was a deeply moving sight to see how they acquitted themselves. I would also add, and here I want to hear your reaction. I thought of all the presentations, the most powerful, the one that had the deepest resonance was by what you described now as the Irish woman. You could see her whole heart, her whole being was in that presentation. And they flashed to the judges, and the judges were gripped. So that was another credit. You tell me now she's Irish, she's white, and yet the most powerful, they were all good, but the most powerful and the most evocative on behalf of the Palestinians is an Irish woman speaking for South Africa. You know, What a wonderful, wonderful display of human solidarity.
Mhm. Well, I'll tell you my reaction, but before doing so, while I can fully understand the first part of your response, I think it also needs to be pointed out that you may be among the most prominent, but from the outset, there have also been a number of Jews, not only within the Palestinian solidarity movement and active in anti-Zionist movements, but also in their leadership. And I think that's becoming particularly prominent among younger US Jews in recent years. There seems to be a total generational shift, if you will, where particularly younger Jews are either indifferent to Israel or actively opposed to it. My response to it, first of all, yes, what you said about no quid pro quo, that's certainly, if you look at it in terms of political calculation, that's certainly correct. But I also had to keep asking myself, is South Africa now also repaying a historic debt and settling a historic account? Because, of course, the PLO played an important role in supporting the South African liberation struggle, in providing training to the guerrillas of Umkhonto we Sizwe when the PLO was based in Lebanon, and perhaps even more importantly, Israel was South Africa's closest international ally during the years of the white minority regime in that country. And I had to keep questioning, the South African political leadership, understanding very well the risks and potential costs of what it did. Were these calculations that perhaps ultimately sealed the decision for them? A second one, very much along the lines of what you were saying at the beginning of your response, Israel has continuously justified its existence, above all, that a Jewish state is the only just response to the Nazi Holocaust. It's in fact become its raison d'etre, its reason for being. And it has justified many of its most depraved policies as necessary to prevent a second Holocaust. And it has, for example, dismissed the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Conventions to the occupied territories by saying, well, these were drafted in 1949 for situations like those that you had in occupied Europe during the 1940s, and they're not really relevant in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That argument, irrespective of the outcome of this case, no longer exists. I think Israel will, for the rest of its days, be tainted by the stigma of genocide. And I think it will now, for the rest of its days, no longer be able to claim the moniker of Jewish state and will be seen as the Zionist state with all that it entails. And finally, I found the case just so, as I mentioned earlier, utterly devastating and comprehensive and compelling. I mean, it was layer upon layer upon layer. And I don't mean to take anything away from the presentation that you found most compelling, but the one I think that remained with me more than any other was the presentation on intent, for two reasons. First of all, of course, because everything that Israel has done can be dismissed in a genocide case unless you can demonstrate intent. And secondly, because in that presentation, it was just, one example after the other, political leaders, military commanders, members of parliament, civil society, media, media makers.
That was a critical aspect.
And
I would like it if you
but-
can, because there are a lot of people here
Yeah.
who won't even know what we're referring to when you
Yes.
say intent. So
Yes,
maybe you can just elaborate each point so listeners can.
I will in a moment.
Sure.
I just wanted to finish that point and say, not only did he, at least in my view, make a persuasive case for intent, but he went that one step further and showed how it was translated into action. In other words, how it was received
By the
by the
soldiers.
soldiers on the ground and implemented. Now, you can perhaps argue that Israeli society has, in certain respects, become genocidal in itself, and it didn't need orders, so to speak. But that to me is what sealed the case. Now, in response to the point you just made, we went over the definition of genocide yesterday, so I won't be repeating it here. But genocide is not just mass murder. It's not just depriving. It's not just imposing conditions of life on a people to ensure that life cannot continue. You have to do it with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a specific category of people for that reason. And again, to the extent that Israel is going to argue that regardless of what one may think of its campaign and the excesses and so on, that it's ultimately an attempt to eradicate Hamas and not Palestinian society in the Gaza Strip, that's going to be an exceptionally difficult argument for them to sustain
Totally
in the
agree.
face of the overwhelming evidence that was presented by the South African team
I
today.
totally agree. There are many things to comment on, and I'm going to rely on you to be systematic about it because my reactions are scattered, whereas you have an agenda before you, so you can direct me when I'm going off course. But
Sure.
just to rely on that point, I wasn't at the beginning very overwhelmed by that presentation, only because I've read a half dozen compendia now.
Including the South African submission.
Yeah, of the statements, the genocidal statements that have been made by the Israeli government. The one thing that he did do that was unlike the statements we've read elsewhere is he made, as you say, he showed this as a horizontal fact of Israeli society, namely, you can go from a television show, you can go to the Knesset, you can go to the military leadership, you can go to the political leadership, at every level, at every horizontal level of the elite of Israeli society.
Genocide is a flavor of the month.
They were totally out of control in their genocidal statements. And one of the points that fellow made is he said, usually no countries acknowledge committing genocide. You're not supposed to broadcast it. He said, usually there's silence. And as a factual matter, it was true with the Nazi Holocaust.
Yeah.
Well into the Holocaust, even Jews did not believe it was happening. So when information leaked out, a lot of it was dismissed because it was thought this can't possibly be happening. And also because Hitler was constantly and Goebbels were making elliptical statements. The Jews will regret having unleashed this war. We warned them in 1939. Even they were exercising a certain amount of discretion in public. And so the presenter said today, this is a very unusual situation because we have a voluminous number of statements, and then that's at the horizontal level. And then he said at the vertical level, he said there is a straight arrow line between Prime Minister Netanyahu's Amalek statements and the Amalek statements that you could see emanating from the soldiers on the ground.
Yes.
So it's not as if these were just blowhard statements. These statements had practical effect on the ground.
Exactly. And on that point, I mean, Holocaust deniers, if I'm not mistaken, always say, well, where's the memo written by
Yeah,
Hitler?
with the famous "Where is the memo?"
Yeah.
Where's the written order?
Yeah.
Yes.
And here you don't have a memo, you have memos.
Exactly. And there was it was interesting. There are many aspects. As I said, we can speak for hours about this, in my opinion. They decided to exercise, they said it, we're not going to give shock images.
Mhm.
Not going to use shock images. I think that was a kind of warning to Israelis because they knew Israel was going to start showing that 47-minute famous video now. And they said, we're not going to do that. The words speak for themselves. We don't need those shock images. And they also said, out of respect to the Palestinians, we're not going to display these gory babies, bodies of babies. But they did show the video. It was a little bit off. You can disagree with me on this because it was a Hezbollah. It was they were dancing this was Amalek.
The soldiers.
Yes.
Yes.
But they were identifying not Hamas, but Hezbollah in that particular song. But it was so horrible. Even I got a little shook up when you showed them dancing. They were doing like the equivalent of literally the equivalent of a horror at a bar mitzvah. And no, it was like the horror. Except we're going to kill everybody. In this case, we're going to kill everybody. We're going to kill everybody. We're going to annihilate everybody.
And repeatedly saying, women, men, children,
Yes.
young, old,
Yeah.
we're going to kill them all.
Yeah. So they established, the technical term is the line of command.
Yes.
Started at
Command
the top,
responsibility.
but yes, criminal responsibility at the command level. So that was very powerful, that aspect of it. I'll just throw in something here, and then I'd like to hear your response. One of the things that struck me about the South African presentation is what a huge disadvantage they were at. The disadvantage became very apparent very quickly. They constantly had to predict what the Israeli arguments were going to be and try to anticipate the response. In a normal proceeding, I don't know what happened here, but South Africa had a written submission. Israel didn't. So you don't know what their arguments are going to be. And that being the case, they were in this very unenviable position of having to anticipate, well, if they argue this, and if they argue that, and if they argue this, and if they argue that, which is in effect saying they squandered approximately 3/4 of their time
responding to what may or may not be said tomorrow.
And 3/4 will probably not be said. They already have a strategy, what they're going to focus on, and they're not going to even raise these arguments. So it was a perplexity to me after I watched it. Why wasn't Israel required to submit a written response to the South African case?
It's a good question. And if I recall correctly, it was quite late in the day when Israel indicated to the ICJ that it would be participating in the proceedings. I may be wrong on that, but that's my recollection. And presumably they have the right not to provide a written submission.
Yes, well, it's clear they did, but it was a serious disadvantage because Israel has a double advantage. It has the written submission, it has the oral submissions, so it can pick and choose the arguments that it's going to make. They could say, well, let's skip that argument. We're going to lose on that one. Let's choose this one because this is our strongest argument. South Africa couldn't do that.
But having said that, I think you had the written submission, which the judges have already had the chance to read and analyze and review. And today, in their oral statements, they did indeed spend a considerable amount of time countering argument that Israel may be making tomorrow. And it was that, I think, that made their case so utterly compelling, because in my view, they foreclosed virtually any meaningful argument that Israel may be making tomorrow. And I believe it was in the summation or the request for provisional measures where
That was Von Low.
yeah, stated very clearly, there are no extenuating circumstances
Genocide.
for genocide. We've either presented a plausible case for genocide or we haven't. And if we have, there is nothing Israel can say in its defense to lessen that plausibility.
Yes, that was an important point by Von Low. He said, we're not going to dispute the horror that occurred on October 7th, but
But it's irrelevant. Yeah.
no horror of any magnitude can justify unleashing a genocide.
Exactly.
So that was, I thought also, that was a
There's no self-defense argument in defense of genocide. Yeah.
I would say, again, I'm going to be scattered, but I had so many reactions. I felt there were two arguments, in my opinion, that should not have been made. Now, whether or not Malcolm Shaw is going to grasp at them, I can't predict. I would say the two arguments that I would not have made were the very first and almost the last, so to speak, the bookends.
Remind us.
Okay. I felt that the very first person to speak, whose name I can't remember, he began by effectively saying everything from Israel's founding was illegal, because it begins with the ethnic cleansing and so on and so forth. I think if Malcolm Shaw is
not to be confused with Malcolm X by any stretch of imagination.
Shaw is such a horrible creature that you cannot confuse with him with anyone except the devil. So I think Shaw is going to grasp at that and say, this is what this case is really about. It's about delegitimizing the Jewish state. And that was handed to him on a silver platter. I get it, because the South African struggle was at its core about delegitimizing the state.
And that lawyer specifically referenced Israeli apartheid in his statement, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Yes, but you understand, because you know the history as well as I do. Its legal genealogy is very different. The UN eventually delegitimized
South Africa, the white minority region. Yeah.
But in the case of Israel-Palestine, it legitimized the Jewish state. So, and as you know, these organizations like the UN is heavily dependent on precedent. It's very hard to get them to reject and reverse a precedent that was set. So as you remember, when Yasser Arafat declares for a Jewish state in November 1988.
Well, recognition of Israel.
Yes, he begins with UN Partition Resolution 181. Yeah, that's the foundational resolution. You can't.
You're talking about the Declaration of Palestinian Statehood on the 15th of November, 1988.
Yes. So I can get where he was coming from, but I thought, don't go there. Don't go there, because he's going to grasp it and then make a big peroration about this is what it's all about. The attempt to delegitimize the only Jewish state in the world. We all know it. And then I thought Von Low, who's a very smart fellow, you may recall him as the person who argued the Wall case.
In 2004.
Yes, at the ICJ. I have to say, just parenthetically, this was a very sweet moment for me personally, and I will tell you why. As you know, I get zero professional recognition. The masses like me, but academia does not.
To your credit.
Maybe, and in my entire career, I've been like a couple of occasions where I got professional recognition. And as you know, I only learned international law on my own. I sat down and I have no professional training in it. And the first major article I wrote on it was on the ICJ decision on the wall in 2004. And I sent it to Vaughn Lowe. For those of you who are listening, he was the last person to speak of the main presenters. He was the last person to speak. And he's from, is it Oxford? I can't remember right now.
I'm not sure.
Yeah. In any case, when I sent him the article, I expected, this is an Oxford Don. I'm not going to get the time of day. And I was so surprised. He responded, he said that my article was, quote, exceptionally clear and beautifully clear.
Beautifully written.
He wrote it beautifully clear.
Beautifully clear.
Yeah. Coming from a Brit, they have the monopoly on language, as you know. On the
An understatement.
Yeah. So it was nice. And the same thing, the other old white dude, as they call, in my
John Dugard.
Dugard, and he had called me the most serious scholar in the Middle East. So it was at that level too, it was gratifying to see them. In any case, I thought Lowe made an error. And I want to hear your reaction. I want to hear your reaction to both. I thought Lowe made an error. He harped on that technical point that because the West Bank and Gaza are occupied territories, under international law, they can't invoke the right of self-defense because the right of self-defense is only relevant between states.
Correct.
That's what the ICJ stated
in 2004
advisory opinion. Now, you know what a good lawyer is going to do with that. You see, they're saying that after October 7th, we had no right to defend ourselves. We had no right to react. And if any reaction by us is, according to them, illegal under international law, I don't think he should have gone to that point. I think it's a technical point. And then he said, of course, and then he said, but that's not the only point. And then it's when he made the argument about you don't have the right to engage in genocide. But I don't think he should have made that technical point because remember, we're ultimately talking to the public. Yes, there is the jury, the jurists, but ultimately we're talking to the public. And does the public believe they have no right to self-defense? No, that's not a tenable position for the public.
Well, and international law does say they have the right to protect their citizens from harm.
Yes, but he didn't say that.
No.
You see, he harped on the technical point.
My response to you regarding the first point in the opening presentation, I think his motivations probably reflect the way that you described them. But having said that, I think he was also keen to demonstrate that genocide is a process and it's not something that first occurred to the Israeli leadership on October 7th. And he was seeking to show that this is embedded in decades of Israeli policy towards the Palestinian people, going back to the very establishment of the Israeli state. And I think it was an important argument to make because in contrast to citing one of the finer points of international law, which are going to be very well known to the judges at the ICJ and who don't need an education on this, one can assume that they're much less well versed in the history of the Palestine question and in the history of Israeli conduct towards the Palestinian people. So while I get your point, and I'm sure that Malcolm Shaw will seek to weaponize the statement, I think it also makes sense to show, it's not as if Israelis and Palestinians have spent 75 years throwing stones at each other, and all of a sudden there's genocide. No, that the Nakba is a process, and what we're seeing now is the culmination of much deeper historical dynamics that have been in play for decades. So I think that was an important point to make, irrespective of how it's going to be mobilized by the Israelis tomorrow. On the second point, I think I would agree with you. This is not a point that needs to be made to the International Court of Justice. Not only do they already know it, they've already said it. And to the extent that your audience is the broader public, if you don't take the time to make these finer distinctions, probably it'll be lost on a lot of listeners. But I'll defer to him on that as well. There's two individuals. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I felt that the presentations today bore out my prediction. I said there are two ways to approach this problem, as a legal problem or as a factual one.
Mm-hmm.
And the most powerful presentations today were the ones that dealt with the factual issues.
Yes.
What's happening?
Mm.
John Dugard, who's leading the case, he's described as leading the case, they left to him a very technical issue.
Which I think he presented exceptionally well.
Oh, yeah. You could see.
I mean, even I understood it.
Yeah, it was a kind of a setup.
Yeah.
You could see that Dugard had talked to Ramaphosa
Mm-hmm.
early on.
The South African president.
Yeah, Cyril Ramaphosa. They're friends. I know. I don't like Ramaphosa. He's a little too rich for my taste. He's one of the richest men in all of Africa. Not my cup of tea. But I know from talking to Professor Dugard that he supported Ramaphosa. He wanted to get past the era of the previous Prime Minister Zuma.
Jacob Zuma, the president. Yeah.
And you could see they sat down, and Professor Dugard told him, in order to bring this case, we need to create a dispute. Mm-hmm. And in every venue, the South African government was reiterating that this is a genocide. Israel's not agreeing. So they built up the case for a dispute, and they left it to John Dugard, the venerable John Dugard, to make the case.
And listening to his presentation, it occurred to me the Israelis probably didn't have a clue what was going on.
I agree with that.
At the time. Yeah.
I agree with that. Why do they keep bringing this up?
Yeah.
That's what the Israelis are scratching their heads.
Yeah.
Why do they keep bringing this up at every forum?
Yeah. Is it is it just because of the long range artillery we used to supply Pretoria, or is it because we detonated a nuclear weapon together with the Bothas?
Yeah. So Dugard was the technical issue.
Yeah.
There were other technical points that were discussed. One person handled the Irish woman. She had her technical point was, if the others qualified as genocide, be it Russia or Gambia, and she named a number of cases, how can this not qualify as genocide? But then she just piled on the horrors with an extreme personal reaction, this shock and disgust at what we are conveying here.
And I thought the other thing, maybe on a more technical level, that I thought she did very well, she began her presentation in French and then apologized for not having provided a French translation of the submission. And not only is there a French judge, but there are also Francophone countries, and they do have a certain, let's say, French disdain for English, however you want to put it. And I thought it was quite smart to play on this point.
I thought she was French and she began. So now
Yeah.
she's neither French nor English. She's actually Irish.
To my understanding,
Yeah,
yes.
no, it was a very good show.
Yeah.
Vaughan Lowe dealt with the question, basically the technical question was of whether any kind of horror could justify resorting to genocide. But on balance, it was a recital of the factual record of what Israel has done in Gaza, and how can you possibly not issue a restraining order in the face of this horror.
Yeah.
My guess is tomorrow, which you may want to get to a little later, my guess is tomorrow they're going to focus on the legal side.
Yeah.
They're going to say, if I were them, I would first start with the horror of October 7th, probably some images, although now they're going to be put in an unfortunate, a hard position, because the other delegation already said we're not going to do that.
Oh, I don't think it'll stop them.
Yeah. Yes, I agree.
It's all they have.
Yeah, it's true. Well, then the next thing they're going to say is that crimes might have occurred, but our legal system is able to accommodate them. We have a very good legal system.
We once convicted a soldier for stealing a credit card from a home in Gaza. Yes.
They'll say we once convicted a soldier, but they won't say for what. So that's the next line of attack. Even if crimes occurred, under international law, it's that principle for your listeners of complementarity. That an international institution doesn't adjudicate until and unless the national institution doesn't handle the situation. And as you know, there have been a couple of cases opened up by Israel, because it's, was preparing for this moment, of prosecuting soldiers who had gone too far. So that's going to be their next line of attack. And then the third line of attack is going to be, this is not genocide, this is self-defense.
Yeah.
That's how. So I think they're going to steer clear of those factual questions, because, as you just said, that's not a path that is wise to walk down.
Yeah.
It's not really starvation, because a couple of foods are getting in.
Yes.
And then they're going to say, of course.
And we've been working closely with Antony Blinken to get an extra truck in every week. So, yeah.
And you could see how they anticipate a lot of the arguments, because Netanyahu, you saw, went on that video and said that we gave warnings to people to leave. And one of the presenters said today,
on that point,
on October 13th, they got 24 hours to evacuate the whole of the north of Gaza. And what about the elderly? And what about the people in the hospitals? And what about being bombed as you're evacuating? So,
on that point, I'm sure you remember this, but one thing, in the 70s and 80s, whenever a Palestinian or an Arab would give an effective interview in English and sound perfectly reasonable, the Israeli response was always, well, these people, they say one thing in English and another thing in Arabic, so you can ignore what you've just heard because they say the exact opposite. When, a complete fraud and invention. But I was reminded of it because Netanyahu yesterday gave a statement in English saying he wouldn't accept or that Israel is opposed to the resettlement of Palestinians outside Gaza or something along those lines. And he simply didn't have the balls to say it in Hebrew because his coalition would collapse.
It was striking how humbled they were this time. There is no possibility any other Israeli leader would have made a video clip like the one Netanyahu made yesterday. It was so ingratiating, which is, as you know, not.
It must have shortened his life by a few years to have to say that.
Ingratiating your peers is not an known Israeli trait.
Yeah.
But you could see it was actually a wake-up call.
I think it was a body double who said that, by the way.
They are worried.
Mm.
There's no possibility he would have issued such a humble and, dare we say, humiliating statement, given that he's an Israeli, who they're always the fighter, the Jewish fighter. And suddenly he was reduced to wearing a diaper in public. It was interesting how their wings have been clipped. You remember the famous sentence, the famous line by David Ben-Gurion.
Doesn't matter what the Goyim say, what matters is what the Jews do.
But there was another one when somebody brought to his attention some discontent in the UN.
Shlum.
He said, Shlum.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Who the F cares what the UN says? Shlum. And it's always quoted.
Yes.
This time it wasn't Shlum.
No, it was, we oppose the resettlement. We're not seeking the resettlement of the population of Gaza outside.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And we
So,
go ahead.
We have a few minutes left. I want to raise one other point that we've talked about over the years. Two people went through my mind today. The first of them was Aharon Barak, who is considered by Israel to be the greatest jurist since Hammurabi, and was the president of the Israeli Supreme Court. He has been instrumental in not only legitimizing Israeli policy in the occupied territories, but also some of its, let's say, most depraved policies. And interestingly, during the past year, he has been consistently vilified by the Israeli right wing and by this government in the context of the legislative agenda of the current extreme right Israeli government. But then a few days ago, he was nominated as Israel's judge to the International Court of Justice, because in such cases, any country that has a case before the ICJ is allowed to nominate a judge if they don't already have a national law in the court. But while listening to the Republic of South Africa's presentation, I kept thinking, what must be going through Aharon Barak's mind? He, in his career as a judge and as president of the Supreme Court, he used to hear arguments like this all the time and just wave them away with his hand and rule in favor of the Israeli security establishment or the Israeli government. And now all of a sudden, he has to take this evidence seriously, and he can't just toss it into the garbage bin.
Well, Aharon Barak was like the Warren Court, the Earl Warren Court. It was a liberal activist court. He was the one that passed all what we might call he codified the whole woke agenda when it came to gay rights and all sorts of things. He was
that concerns Israeli society.
Yes, but when it came to the Palestinians,
he was Jekyll and Hyde.
He was awful. I mean, to the point that even his colleagues and peers, I won't say held him in contempt, that would be an exaggeration, but were very critical. So you will recall for sure, there was a prominent book written by David Kretzmer called The Occupation of Justice. And the core of the book was targeting the opinions rendered by Aharon Barak.
The rulings, yes.
The rulings of Aharon Barak. And there was actually a public square-off between the two of them, which was reported in the pages of Haaretz. So even Israelis recognized that when it came to Palestinians, he had taken a step too far.
I mean,
You
as
have
as you've noted, he's legitimized torture, legitimized the
he
taking of
legalized torture.
hostages. Yeah.
Israel was the first and only country in the world to legalize torture, and that was originally it was by the Landau Commission. You remember?
Yeah, 1989, I believe.
And Landau was another interesting case because Landau was a judge in the Eichmann trial.
Mhm.
And this judge in the Eichmann trial was the head of a commission that legalized torture. And then there were a succession of Israeli Supreme Court or High Court decisions in the 1990s, which turned the recommendations of the commission into the law.
Mhm.
Israel was the only country in the world to legalize torture. Those are the words of B'Tselem, and those are the words of Amnesty International. It was Aharon Barak. Aharon Barak, he eventually overturned that because there was a big campaign by Amnesty International to abolish torture, and he couldn't resist it. The momentum had built too much. He legalized hostage taking. He called it bargaining chips.
Mhm.
And he said
But
that
only if it's done by Israel.
exactly, because it's for the security of the state.
Yes.
He wrote the two decisions which nullified the ICJ opinion on the illegality of the wall. He tried to square it, saying, "Oh, what my decisions are reconcilable with the ICJ opinion," which was a complete lie. And I devoted about 40 pages to demonstrating it was a complete lie. He legitimized the deportation of Palestinians from the West Bank to Gaza without any evidence.
Mhm.
I mean, if you listen to the wording of his verdicts, it's just mind-boggling. So they claim these Palestinians were guilty of subversive activity, and then I think it's a jury case. You remember it, AGAURI? Guilty of subversive activity. Where's the evidence? The Israeli government says this is classified information.
And therefore, we will have to believe them.
That's what he said.
Mm.
With no argument. The government says it. It's true. Case closed. That was, Barak, when it came to the army. Israel is remember, Barak is 87 years old. He comes to Israel as a boy, and he owes everything to the state.
Mhm.
The state took he calls himself a Holocaust survivor. I don't agree with that, but I'm not going to get into the technical terms. There's a very big difference between escaping the Holocaust and enduring the Holocaust. Henry Kissinger became a Holocaust survivor. Why? Because he got out in 1934. Sorry, buddy. You escaped it. You didn't endure it. It's an insult to the memory of those who passed.
We endured him till 2023.
Yeah, that was a moral Holocaust, that guy. In any event, so he owes everything to the state.
And he paid them back in spades.
Yes.
Mm.
And they see it, that's their mentality. For your audience, there was a very decent fellow named Israel Shahar. He was an organic chemist at Hebrew University. And he was one of the persons who said Israel was a completely totalitarian society until the right wing was elected in 1977 and Menachem Begin came to power. But people like Aharon Barak, they grew up in this kind of totalitarian Stalinist state, and they were totally devoted to the state. So for them, there's no problem to say, I think Netanyahu is horrible for this, and I think Smotrich, is that how you pronounce his name?
Smotrich, yeah.
Smotrich is horrible in this. But at the end of the day, we're all in this together. This is our state. We love our state.
And we will defend it.
Excuse me. Yes. There's no real tradition in Israel.
But I had to keep thinking, Aharon Barak is not going to hear anything he's not already familiar with, but now he's in this very strange position
I thought
of
the same
having
thing.
to take it seriously and being the people who he can't order to just pretend this evidence doesn't exist and rule on the basis of what's best for Israel.
And also, you can't help but think he must be a little bit embarrassed. You know, all of his rulings, who knows about them outside the country?
Mm-hmm.
Who even knows Israel was practicing torture? Aside from a handful of people who are involved in the solidarity
rights movement, yeah.
You know, but suddenly it's before the eyes of the world, and he can't just engage, as you put it, in his usual bureaucratic maneuvers to pretend that's what's there is not there. Now it's out in the open. And I did wonder, like you, I suppose, how is he reacting when they're going through these statistics, these numbers, these statements? How does he assimilate, digest these statements that are now being broadcast to the world? And he's sitting there, and occasionally the camera turns to him. It could not have been, you know, the expression about airing the dirty laundry in public. Well, now the dirty laundry is being aired in public, and Israel is just a little village. And when he comes to the United States, he wears his liberal hat, and everybody loves him as the great liberal judge, like Earl.
He has Dershowitz singing his praises night and day.
Yes, he should win the Nobel Prize, says Dershowitz. And now he's sitting on that presidium, and all of it is coming out. It could not have. I think he would have preferred to be somewhere else at that point.
And speaking of people being somewhere else, the other person who came to mind today is someone who actually has nothing to do with this case, except that his institution's failures were mentioned in the South African submission. And that's Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who has done literally nothing from the get-go and has announced that he intends to do nothing when he first took office, has gone out of his way to file away the Palestine case, but has, as a result of the combination of the Palestinian attacks of October 7th and Israel's genocide, since that date, been spurred into action, spurred into making a few statements, is maybe a little more clear. And he must be watching this now and think
he was alluded to.
Yes.
John Dugard
Yes.
alluded to going to the ICC. And of course, everybody is wondering, why isn't the ICC prosecuting Israel? That was a strategic move by Dugard. Professor Dugard, to my understanding, invested a lot of hope in Karim Khan because he's the grandson of the Pakistani foreign minister,
Mohammad Zafrullah Khan. And actually, he's not the grandson. I was corrected on this point recently. He refers to Mohammad Zafrullah Khan as his adopted grandfather because it seems his biological grandfathers passed away before he was born, and he claims to have had a very close relationship with Mohammad Zafrullah Khan, who was a Pakistani statesman, was a Pakistani foreign minister, and in 1947 was Pakistan's permanent representative to the UN, United Nations General Assembly, and gave what is considered the most eloquent speech against partition, and thereafter, or throughout his career, was a champion of Palestinian rights. And if I can just add on this, I mean, I've spoken to Palestinian diplomats who, when Khan was campaigning for the position of ICC prosecutor, said he made a point of coming to them and saying, you know, I'm the grandson of Mohammad Zafrullah Khan. Palestine is so close to my heart. I will never abandon it. And my sense of that is it wasn't that he was trying to convince the Palestinians, but he was trying to ensure that the Palestinians don't launch a campaign against him.
Uh-huh. Well, it was clear from Professor Dugard's presentation that even though personally he had high hopes for Karim Khan, that he was exposing the fact that the ICC had done nothing. I also noticed that one of the presenters, I can't remember which, described Gaza as having turned into a concentration camp.
Yes.
Now, I took credit for that. I was waiting for my citation, but they claimed that happened after October 7th, whereas I dated from 2004. And I wonder whether Malcolm Shaw is going to grasp that one also. But that I give a pass to. That I give a pass to
because you've used the same term.
On every occasion, people claim.
Norm will be talking a lot about Malcolm Shaw and about Israel's rebuttal, if you will, tomorrow. But I think we can both agree today was a historic day.
It was.
Yeah.
The dignity, the investment, and for me, the most important, the display of pure human solidarity.
Yes.
Remember, I said it yesterday, I'll say it again. It wasn't an Arab state who went to the ICJ. It wasn't a Muslim state that went to the ICJ.
It was a rainbow nation.
Yeah. You know, that's a deep credit. 2.3 million people who are being terrorized before our eyes, and nobody found it in them because they have no quid to offer for the quo.
They prefer to get their quids and their quos from Israel and the United States.
Exactly. And to see them do that, you know.
Yeah.
If the Jewish people had something like that, a lot more might have survived, but nobody took up their cause. There are some rational reasons to that, and I acknowledge that. But I remember my mother saying to me, and I'll leave it at that, she said, I never really was shocked at what the Germans did, because every people has bestial people. You know, bestiality has a long history in human existence. She said what shocked her the most was the indifference of the rest of the world. That she could never assimilate, which is why she ended up saying, I think Jews need a refuge, because our experience was nobody cared for us, what happened to us. And South Africa defied that norm.
Yes.
It defied that norm of the indifference of states when we have no interest.
Yeah. And on that very hopeful note, Norman Finkelstein, thank you so much for another fantastic discussion on connections. Tomorrow at the same time, we will be having a further episode in which we will consider and discuss Israel's oral argument before the International Court of Justice. Thank you.
I'm going to get the last word. Thank you, Mouin. You are a credit not only to scholarship and intellect, but as a human being. And it's my honor. No, I'm serious. You know, I don't give compliments easily. No, you're a very special human being, and I take it as a source of pride to count you as a friend, as a comrade, and a colleague.
The pride is all mine. Thank you, Norman.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Mouin?
Yes.
Before we leave, I'd like to announce that I will be conducting a lengthy set of interviews with you on your quick thoughts that you have been publishing on Jadaliyya next week, on Thursday and Friday, 18th and 19th of January, live here in this studio. So people can stay tuned. Thank you very much, Norman.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mouin. We'll end the feed right now.
Oh, thank you so much, Mr.
Salam.
Qasim.